Hi, welcome to July's Institute for Liberal Values Lab. And today we have, I should have practiced your name, Ryan. Say your name.
Ryan Tsapatsaris.
Tsapatsaris. I didn't practice it often enough. And he's here. Brian and I met at FIRE. He did a great presentation. We've been trying to get him on the lab. We're so happy to have you. And today he's going to talk about the ways that social media has impacted academia. That's one of his research areas. As important as it is to society at large, it's also very impactful for academia. So he's going to talk today about that. I'm hoping that people will be able to type into the chat, type your questions into the YouTube chat, and we will get to those after Ryan's presentation. So thank you very much, Ryan. I'm just going to let you get started.
Great. If I can just share my screen.
You should be able to.
Yeah.
Should have practiced that before we started too, huh?
Is it shared? I apologize.
No, I'm not seeing your screen. Oh, nope, I'm not seeing your screen yet.
Sorry. It should. Can you see it now?
There we go. It's loading. It's circling. Okay.
Great.
Now we've got it.
Great. Sorry, I just want to get back to the beginning. Great.
Yeah. It disappeared again.
I apologize. Okay. Sorry. Now it should be. It should be all set now. It should reappear. Let me know if you can.
Yeah. It took a minute. It's like.
I can't see you actually once now that it should be shared and should be open. I can't actually see myself or you. It's not you still can't see it?
I can't see it now.
That's so I apologize.
Well, I saw it for a minute and then it disappeared.
Let me try to present, share screen.
Yep, I have a couple comments from the audience, nothing yet. So it's not just me and it's not just you. So two comments that say no, not yet.
Okay. It says it's sharing unfortunately. I apologize.
See, no, it's not. I don't think it's you. We should have practiced this before.
Let me see. I might be able to. No, that's not working. It's just so strange because it says I understood why it went down. I know what happened. Share screen. I mean, I'm just gonna try it again.
Yeah. Worst case, you might have to leave and come back.
Yeah. Now it's actually not.
So is it okay with you if I read your summary here?
Please.
While
Yeah,
you're
please
playing
do.
around with that.
Yeah,
so
yes.
So on the one hand, this is Ryan's abstract here. On the one hand, social media has made scholarship more accessible to the public. On the other, the visibility and publicity afforded by these technologies have also been used in very negative ways, particularly by academics themselves. I've been on the receiving end of that, and I know you have too. For nearly a decade, academics have weaponized social media to defame or vilify other scholars with whom they disagree. So in his research, Ryan terms this practice academic cancel campaigns, and its attendant climate, academic cancel culture, which we've definitely heard of. Ryan contextualizes these campaigns in light of both the rise of critical theory in academia and in specific platforms that are amenable to this genesis. Understanding academic cancel culture as providing a blueprint for contemporary governmental intrusion into university procedure. He concludes with some suggestions for campuses and other intellectual institutions to protect academic freedom, liberal values, and pluralism. So Jen just texted me and says, yeah, she said, have him share again. It just said, I put notes in the private chat, but my private chat just says it's loading, so.
Yeah, instead of trying to share it, I'm just uploading them directly right now, which is another way to do it. So it's going to be in you see it uploading in the bottom there? Or maybe you can't see. I can see it
No.
uploading the bottom. And in a second, I should be able to click on it. I apologize.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not loading from PowerPoint, but yeah, I'm
Yeah.
uploading the presentation now. It should hopefully be, and it's not a large presentation. It's not heavy. Um, Jen said
Okay.
it usually loads from the back end.
Yeah, and I don't know what that means entirely.
Yeah, no,
So
and I was using the back end, and I've tried to share it 3 times, and then it wasn't recognizing that PowerPoint was open when it was open. I will admit it was my mistake. Once I shared the first time, I didn't know that there it
yeah.
is.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so like I said, it's in the perfect. It's in the chat. It's not even
Yes.
great. All right. I apologize so much, everyone, for that. And I don't plan to talk too long. I'm mostly interested in hearing people's, feedback, questions. You all now know what my work is about. So I'm Ryan. I recently got my PhD in communication from University of Pennsylvania. I'm currently a Master of Law candidate at Penn Law and a contract researcher. And so thank you so much, both to Jen, Elizabeth, the Institute for Liberal Values, and everyone here today. And so I'm going to, give a brief overview of some of my dissertation research and what I found about the intersection of academia and social media. And so I think it's interesting to start with these 2 tweets. We see sort of what I consider 2 problems here, right? And on the left, someone says, some stuff I see academics post on here beggars belief. Maybe I'm naive, but I don't see the point of getting a PhD and dedicating your life to learning and then saying things you must know are untrue. Like, why not get a job in advertising if you're going to BS and get paid, right? And then on the flip side, we have sort of a critique of what's known as academic Twitter, right? Which is sort of just the name of what's been given to the way in which academics in their vocational and social capacities use Twitter, right? In their professional lives and in general. And someone, somewhat, I think a fair reading wrote, academic Twitter never misses a chance to abandon any measure of grace and compassion and ridicule someone in pain for petty entertainment, right? And I think this was sort of the crux of what I studied. There's academics are being, for lack of a better term, very uncollegial to each other on the internet. We see cancel culture in a lot of facets of society, right? They attempt to silence people or often ruin their livelihood, which for scholars is very, scholars inherently should be on the cutting edge of research and producing new knowledge, and so that makes them possibly even more likely to be targeted by those because they're challenging orthodoxies, right? So it makes them more likely to be challenged. And so that I just wanted to show these 2 tweets as sort of a context and to acknowledge that these aren't necessarily from academics, right? These are from members of the public, because one of the big things I've realized in my research is the members of the public are paying attention to what's happening in universities, and some of that comes from I don't know why the present. Can you also see the presentation?
No, it
Why did
just
I don't
disappeared again.
know, no idea why. I
Well,
I didn't even change the slide.
you
That it
might
just
have
it's
to just continue on without. You're going to have to describe your presentation
uh,
because you can
apparently my
see it. So
right. Okay. Actually, I can't. I'm blocked out too.
oh,
Um, my browser has blocked me allowing to share for some reason. I can see the presentation now that I'm reopening it. But
yeah,
I don't understand. It's in line. I'm so sorry.
it's not.
Um, right. Okay. So what I study is what I've termed academic cancel culture, academic cancel campaigns, right? And I describe those as an attempt to use social media to vilify or otherwise defame a scholar or their scholarship, particularly when that scholar's ideas don't conform to what popular ideas are, right? Like in the orthodoxy. There's some cancel culture for a while was denied as to exist, right? People were saying, oh, there's no such thing, right? And then the sort of the defenses turned to, oh, well, it only affects a small number of people, which is, I'm sure you can imagine, is still harmful, right? A small number of people being harmed is still a small number of people, right? That's not a good defense. And so in recent years, there's been a bit of scholarly conversation about cancel culture, and it's sort of timed to beginning around 2013, 2014 in the social media form, right? And then I'm talking about it. But it really hits its stride in 2017, and then continue. Oh, lovely. They reappeared. And then continues on into 2020, and beyond, right? I do think we're currently seeing maybe a moment of lessened lessen cancel culture. But in general, it's still happening. In regards to scholarship, it's become sort of a new feedback mechanism for scholarly production. Also, when this slide does appear, just so you know, these are cited. It feels like I'm plagiarizing because I'm mentioning other people's ideas to you and you can't see the citations. I promise they're cited on the slide, right? One scholar has argued that it's a synecdoche, like it's a way for disagreements regarding truth and who can speak in a democratic society. That is true. It is a fight over speech. It may not be the most functional for a democratic society, but that is what I think is the crux of a lot of quote unquote cancel campaigns. And one thing that I like to really point out when I discuss cancel culture is there have been a couple notably Black feminist responses sort of critiquing the way cancel culture manifests, right? Both activist Adrienne Marie Brown and a scholar named Loretta Ross have argued that cancel culture's manifestation now is not a continuation of historical calls for like equality, right? Their argue is that this is qualitatively different, and I think the viciousness of that is something the viciousness of cancel culture and the attacks on people's livelihood, and we see that, right? So I think those are really astute critiques, because one of the other sort of defenses of cancel culture that you see is people say, well, this is a way of attacking people in power. That might have been true. Again, that's true historically. A lot of times, and I argue this in my research, a lot of times cancel culture campaigns are horizontal, right? And as I point out, it's academic on academic violence, right? And academics are under siege now, maybe from political enemies anyways, never mind. I mean, what I study is the fact that these are coming from inside, the call is coming from inside the house, right? These are academics treating other academics in a very, very terribly, right? So, and so for my case studies, I primarily focused on sort of what other scholars myself term genderism, and I'm going to get into that. But before and it's a form of critical theory, and so I just wanted to I wish you could see my slides, but this slide is about theory, right, and the role of theory, and I think that word gets sort of tossed around without definition a lot, right? And for lay people, non-academics or whatever, when we think theory, we think of like the theory of evolution, right? And theory of evolution, we have evidence, there's proven evidence, but the reason it's called a theory is because it can't be 100% proven, right? But the empirical testing indicates that the theory of evolution is likely true, right? And so all that to say, theory in sort of a lowercase t it's a thing that can be empirically tested. Usually that's what we mean when we talk about theories, right? Theory with a capital T, as some scholars have argued, is best described as a system of concepts employed in the humanities and the social sciences, and it's like the overarching practice of our time in the academy. And I think there's some intentional confusion here. People sort of trade on the fact that scientific theories, due to the humbleness of the scientific method, are not completely proven, to act as though the theories we talk about in academia, and this can be anything from critical race theory to queer theory, and I'm not saying that those are bad or not epistemically useful. I'm just saying that that theory there is doing a lot more work than in the theory of evolution, for example. And then sort of the third prong here is what's known as critical theory, which really a scholar named Bayert describes it as an intellectual tradition that attributes epistemological priority to the notion of critique. Epistemological is sort of just a fancy word to say the way we know things, right? So it means that it puts criticism or critique at the top of the goal of doing this type of scholarship, right? And so that's where it sort of can come into conflict with the Enlightenment values or liberal values, right? So it's just because it's potentially less about discovering the truth and more about revealing or creating the truth, right? Constructing the truth, right? So I don't want to get too deep in the weeds of epistemology here. I think it's interesting. I think it's important to acknowledge that when I use the word theory, I'm not using it what I'm criticizing is not the scientific use, but rather this sort of like semantic game that's played with theory, right? And again, and that's not a means to discredit, again, critical race theory or queer theory. It's just to acknowledge that the theory in queer theory does not mean the same thing as the theory in the theory of evolution. If you can see my slide, it would show it's a different. I mean, the distinction is lowercase versus capital, right? And so that's all to say, the case studies I focus on ended up fighting over the theory of genderism, right? And I want to be clear. So I can't show you this. This actually
So
is very difficult.
you're advancing it, but it's not advancing on the screen. Is that?
Yeah, for some reason it's not.
Oh,
Yeah,
I mean, we
that's only
just keep,
it's slide one. I just can't, slide three and on just don't seem to.
yeah,
Um,
interesting. So,
you know what? Sorry, if you give me 13, I actually might be able to fix that. I just realized that because this next slide is actually pretty important. And I think I can quickly add it. I'm so sorry. Because this slide is like extremely key. No.
yeah.
So yeah. So the next slide is supposed to show why the distinction between so what I'm calling, what I and other scholars call genderism or gender identity ideology, right? Oftentimes this is called transphobic. And the slide shows that the distinctions between being diagnosed with gender dysphoria, right? Being a trans man or trans woman, which is a person who has gender dysphoria, right? Versus genderism, which the major belief, and I have a slide on this, the major belief is that biological sex is not real. And the notion of gender should trump all things in all facets of social life, right? This is not inherently something someone who is trans needs to believe. In fact, many people who have been trans for a long time reject this notion outright. Their argument is that their dysphoria comes from the fact that they believe they're meant to be born the opposite sex, right? And it's respectful to treat them as the opposite sex, right? But the historical argument was never that biological sex wasn't real. And this has ramifications for gay people, same sex attracted, right? Sex being contingent function, as well as for women's sex based rights, right? And that's sort of the major conflict that I studied in these cancel culture campaigns. I had I focused on three major case studies in which women, feminist, lesbian scholars were attacked for their scholarship. Basically, not even always in rejection of genderism. Oftentimes, the work was pro-trans, for lack of a better way to say it, right? And that's actually why I parse this work as saying there's two separate things happening here, right? These works have been accused of transphobia, but in actuality, when you read the works, and the cancel campaigns were predicated on hoping people either hadn't read the work, right? Two of the campaigns were launched before the work even was produced, right? In my third case study, Australian philosopher Holly Lawford Smith's book, before it was published, the chapter titles were published and a huge cancellation campaign began against her, two open letters, tons of signatories. And in my second case study, an abstract for a conference was submitted by 5 lesbian feminist scholars. It was lauded as one of the, excuse me, it was lauded as one of the best conferences in the potential conferences at overall, in the papers, sorry, in the conference overall. And then a single intellectual on Twitter made one Twitter thread about it. The conference organizers did an about face, completely basically they kicked the scholars out of the conference. They told them that if they were to present, there would be an asterisk on their name in the panel saying the work was unethical, right? And so the scholars opted not to lean into that. And so those were sort of the examples of the case studies that I use in my dissertation. Without the PowerPoint, and I'm going
Well,
to mention a couple of my research.
you should just take these off. If it's not going to advance, you should just quit sharing
Yeah,
because it's
sorry.
apparently not going to.
Yeah.
Not going to
So
cooperate. So.
yeah. So I mean, I've just kind of discussed my research questions. What I think without the PowerPoint, I think the most useful thing is just to share some of the data so people understand, the audience, people understand from my research sort of the viciousness of what these campaigns look like, right? I think I think that if anything just be taken from this, that's sort of what I'm always, because my work is primarily descriptive. I do just explain cancel culture and stuff, but one of the major important aspects that I was interested in was collecting sort of just how vicious these academics were to each other. I mean, and I should mention, I mentioned this on my, when I discussed where I got my data, every single tweet, post, everything I used was public. I didn't do anything shady. Every single thing that I posted was public. So that means that when every single academic really said something horrible at another academic, they had no problem doing this in public, oftentimes in flagrant view of their peers, not just like in esoteric places, right? I mean, they're tagging people, these were the intent is to damage the reputation of the target. That is the point of a cancel campaign, right? Potentially to get the work silenced or what have you, but the real goal is to really damage reputation. both professional and often social, right? Off the record, I've had canceled scholars admit to me that people they've known for 20 years no longer speak to them. They lose PI ships. I mean, it's to be targeted like this is not pleasant. I've only been targeted. I've interestingly been targeted by both the alt-right and the left for different parts of my
You
research.
should be flattered.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so in the current moment, it feels like a win. But I've only been sort of semi-canceled. The publicity of this talk might change that. But in general, I've been lucky. And again, if I haven't got this across, and you'll see this in a piece that I have out, I'm going to direct people to it at the end. Women generally are targeted more than men in my research in the data. I had sort of seen that anecdotally and wanted to see if it bore out. I do not have a complete quantitative example yet, but having looked at this for so long, it definitely feels that the targets are predominantly women, which is upsetting and sad. I mean, that's another layer of why this is a problem, right? Because we do know women are, harassed pretty aggressively on the internet anyways, and then we would hope that academics behave better, right? And so my research questions are about cancel campaigns, right? Is there a template for how they function? Are certain platforms more amenable to cancel campaigns than others? What's the role of institutions, right? Because as academics, we're all usually connected to a university or even or a think tank, academic adjacent, right? We're all in the same sort of professional world, and so what are the institutions doing? And then my final sort of question was about what do we learn about the figure of like the networked academic, right? The academic who lives in the age and is forced to live in the age of social media, right? Because I even as a graduate student, am upset to have learned that my social media presence is part of my career CV resume. I'm very uncomfortable with that, so I'm super private. I have like 200 Twitter followers, right? I reject that side of it. But as you'll notice, I didn't say I was a professor. I'm a contract researcher, so take that how you will. Um, and so, just briefly, the data of my project was about 2,000 comments or posts and about 5,000 interactions. I really would look at the person who posted the primary tweet or some sort of post attacking a scholar and then go through all the comments, interactions. Again, because a lot of people use their real names both on Facebook and Twitter/X. I was able to cross check where their disciplinarity, is this a scholar? Who is this person, right? My data set is primarily scholars. One interesting part of my data set was that the public regularly defends scholars when other scholars do not. The final case study, the Australian philosopher mentioned Lawford Smith. Rare was the academic defender of her, and there were like 1,000 tweets from academics attacking her work, her book that hadn't been published yet. But members of the public really stepped up and defended her. And I thought that was something that, in research, I believe you should always, to do research, you shouldn't be surprised by things, right? You shouldn't go in knowing the answers, right? That's what I'm not talking about with theory, right? Sometimes theory already knows the answers, right? And that's not a critique. There are theorists who admit that in their writing. It is a critique, but that is in the literature. Whereas when I do scholarship, I want to learn something. And, I had strong feelings, I would say, about certain aspects of this, but I learned that my biggest takeaway was the public really impressed me. And I was proud to see people defend scholars when, again, their peers were not. And that was something that I learned that I think is a lesson to take away from all of this. And so I can read these. So now the slides are less important. Now I can kind of read you a couple things. So the one thing I mentioned I wanted to talk about a little bit was the data, examples for my data. And I want to read one exchange between a senior feminist scholar and another senior feminist scholar about one of the cancel targets. Her name was Rebecca Tubell. She's a feminist philosopher. And so this happened on Facebook. And I only have I just want to mention a few of these data points.
So this is two other academics talking about a third academic.
Yes. Okay. One in critique, one in defense. Right. And the third academic is named Rebecca Tubell. And so the first academic in critique says, they say that Tubell should not have been blindsided by the reaction to the publication of her article. I visited her, I'm actually paraphrasing it. I visited her college in 2015 and gave a talk about the racial politics of Rachel Dolezal, because this is about Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who identified as Black. People may remember that from about 7 or 8 years ago. the academic continues, Professor Duvel attended my talk and the dinner afterwards presented her argument to me, and we engaged in a long, protracted, but civil exchange about it. I expressed my objections due to the serious lack of engagement with the histories of construction of Blackness. And then she says, and she signed an open letter against her. This is, because this is post facto. She said, the reason I signed the open letter was primarily to object to the failures in the editorial and review process at the journal that published it. That allowed such a weak and ill-informed piece of scholarship into print. However, I find my sympathy for Professor Duvel, the target of this, tempered by my experience of her utter refusal to listen to critique, right? And so we see this anecdote where, again, just to catch up, two scholars had a conversation at dinner, and then once one of them is under fire, the other one's saying, well, I don't really feel bad for her because. And in credit to the scholars who have defended people, the response to that scholar was actually so another scholar defends Duvel, and her response is phenomenal. I'm going to read it verbatim this time. She says, this is horrifying. Duvel, quote, should not have been blindsided by the reaction to her article because you and she previously engaged what sounds like contentious yet civil and stimulating discussion about it over dinner. Thus, she should not have been surprised that hundreds of supposedly feminist academics would write an open letter denouncing her and her peer-reviewed scholarship. Did it ever occur to you to write a philosophical response to Duvel's piece debunking the logical fallacies in her piece? Do tell. And I don't know, submit it to a feminist journal for publication. What most horrifies me about your response here is that you are continuing to engage in character assassination of Duvel. Your, quote, sympathy is tempered by your experience of her utter refusal to listen to critique. In other words, the bitch asked for it and was too stupid to see it coming. And that was there's a very strong evocative defense of Duvel here. And I think it's very fair. I mean, obviously I'm going to openly acknowledge my bias here, but I do think that was a very fair rejoinder. For more context, because, we didn't see the slide. At the time, Professor Rebecca Duvel was an untenured, recently graduated graduate student and was, excuse my language, the target of a large shitstorm that comes up in the literature because of an essay she wrote, not defending necessarily the right to change races, Rachel Dolezal case. What she argued in her piece was that the arguments against allowing for people to change race that people are using against Rachel Dolezal when, all of society was harassing that poor woman, are very similar to the transphobic arguments used to discredit trans people. It was actually a very brilliant piece in that way. And Duvel is on record, and I think this is very honest, of saying, I wrote my piece to argue that when we keep rigidity to categories, the status quo sticks, right? Her work was not intended to be either anti-Black or transphobic, right? The one happiness about that case is that many people she had a solid sort of circle of defenders. Her dissertation advisor, she had 6 people on her dissertation committee. 2 of them joined in on the fray of attacking her. One wrote a very strong defense of her, which was very attractive. Very nice, and in my opinion, sort of the way an advisor is supposed to protect their graduate students, right? I think a lot of people have that opinion, right? And so it was unfortunate, and in my these relationships too sort of maybe speak to the relationship, the nature of academia. In my second case, the woman who went after the 5 scholars was an advisee of one of them, right? A graduate advisee, and so we see this sort of back and forth between those 2 groups, and so then I think I'm going to just mention a couple more sort of from the data, a couple more commentaries, right? Someone defending Duvel said, through every medium imaginable, senior feminist scholars were pressuring, even threatening Duvel that she wouldn't get tenure and her career would be ruined if she didn't retract her article. When I called out the worst insulters for threatening an untenured junior feminist, they claimed they were the victims, not her, just to give you an idea of the, right? On the case about the Australian philosopher, and this one's interesting because that was a scholar. This is from a member of the public, said, discussing her book, I wonder if it's kept under the counter in a brown paper bag. Possibly you need to buy it from a man in a trench coat on a real street corner. Psst, hey, lady, you want to buy some real feminism? This stuff isn't cut with intersectionality. It'll blow your mind, right? And then other members of the public jumped. There was sort of they were joking that they were treating Holly Lawford Smith like the Salem witch trials. And so one of the jokes was, I saw Goody Smith dance with the devil, #burn the witch, #burn the witch, #ban the books, how embarrassing, which was they were criticizing the press. And then I think most, again, from a layperson, not, again, I don't mean to say that there's some big distinction between academics and lay people, just for the sake of this argument. I mean, people who don't happen to work in the scholarship. Obviously, there are many fascinating lay intellectuals, and I say that as someone who studies social media. I see lay intellectualism everywhere. But this was from, again, a non-academic who said, you people are not fit to call yourselves academics. Buy the book, read it, make an argument. but you can't do that, can you? You can't defeat reality no matter how much Butlerian obfuscation you crowbar in. So what do? Try to ban it. Disgusting. No integrity. And so again, the public's response was so fascinating because they were so supportive of this feminist philosopher who, and I'm not saying academia cast her out to dry. I think some of it comes from the fact that sort of US academia is generally US centric. I just think as the story, she's gotten a lot of support as time has gone on. At the time, a lot of it had to do with her geographic location, and it was being printed by Oxford University Press. So it was the Anglophone, but it was a bit out of the the USian area, right? So, and that actually, I'm going to kind of conclude with this. One of the most impactful factors on success of a cancellation campaign is speed. In fact, speed matters more than platform. The second case study was canceled, and the whole thing happened in like 3 days and completely was able to shut the research down. Whereas in Rebecca Duval's case and with Lawford Smith, the cancellation campaigns lasted so long that the duration was so long they were unsuccessful. And so speed ends up being that was another sort of takeaway from my research, is that speed is a major factor. I thought platform would really matter because they generally used to happen on Twitter, probably still do, Twitter/X. But comparing to Twitter cancellations, they kind of happen vaguely differently. And again, platform does matter. Platform matters, but speed is key, to be honest with you. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll leave it there. Like I said, the network academic ends up being highly public. We see increased scrutiny. That can go both ways. Just as much as we can be canceled by a member of the public, or an academic can try to raise the public up against an academic. I've also found optimistic places where the public has been the sole defender of an academic, right? So, this is a bittersweet pill, and in a moment when academia, is quite under focused by both the public, the current administration, the spotlight's on academia right now. I hope my work helps explain to people outside the academy, both on one hand, how bad things have gotten in the academy, but also that, there are dissidents, there are people speaking up, places like FIRE, ILB, this has helped some academics get to know other academics and commune peers, right, and create our own networks, which, is helpful. And so really just thank you so much for your time. And I just had a piece published in Queer Majority that, again, because you couldn't see my slides, might help a bit. It's called Academia in an Age of Assholes, in case you're wondering why I'm unemployable. Yeah, and so you can check that out. It's an easy Google search. Again, it's called Academia in an Age of Assholes for Queer Majority. And I think it'd be sent out on the email list and what have you. But if you're not connected with ILV, get on their mailing list. And then, but also, that article is sort of really condenses what I said. And I do apologize for not having the slides. The slides would have made it a bit easier, but I hope it was relatively coherent. And again, please answer any questions, things that wasn't clear. So thank you so much.
Yeah, so do type in, and I also have my phone, so sometimes people text me questions, but do type into the chat. I have a couple of questions. So I was reading recently, and now I can't cite it, but I was reading an article about how someone had traced some of these sort of cancel culture sort of things, and that they were continuing offline, like on 4chan and stuff, where they were basically bragging about what they had done. So they weren't as interested anymore in the target. They were interested in sort of patting each other on the back. And so I was wondering if you have any sort of, I know you've been working on this kind of thing for a while. So have you seen any sort of that kind of activity?
So that's fascinating. I haven't. So 4chan. So one of my other pieces of research is on 4chan. And we did some research and found out that there were a group of users on 4chan who were manipulating the site's affordances. Like they found a way to sort of play the system to make sure that their narrative was always on the top of the r/politics section. And their narrative was about Donald Trump, right? The goal was to keep it was called PTG, President Trump General, on the top. I am familiar with some research from Gamergate where MRA activists sort of had their chats got leaked, and they definitely were sort of congratulatory of each other for like harassing the feminists, right? But no, that's I haven't heard that. That's interesting. I mean, I assume it's sort of like a Durkheimian ritual, right? You get all worked up. I mean, I don't know. I never canceled anybody. I guess
Yeah.
that's the we may have
Yay.
been canceled. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
but
it
no,
was
that's
just this
I hadn't.
fascinating, yeah, this sort of fascinating dynamic where they were keeping it alive. Not, it was almost like the goal at that point was just to keep their little community of, here's what I did to someone, going. It's like I guess it's like, well, I don't have anybody to cancel right now, but I can still go back to that other thing and say how great it was. So we have another, says, can you talk more about the role that institutions in the role of institutions in academic cancel campaigns? What characteristics do these institutions have versus a better institution? Have you seen any patterns there?
So I love that question because I'm always so proud to say that in the case of Rebecca Tuvel, and in that case, her article was published in the top tier feminist philosophy journal, right? The feminist philosophy journal backed her 100%. In fact, that is the paradigmatic example. In my again in my humblest opinion, but their willingness, and now there was, and I make this point in the article, the queer majority piece I referenced, the, the editors did not leave that unscathed. There was a bit of a mutiny among the junior editors, and that was what led to the retraction call. The main primary editor stood strong, and then basically it became so untenable. Her and another editor actually resigned. But again, the answer is stand by your scholars, right? So there are institutions that have done that. Privately, higher members of the Penn administration have stood by me in instances such as this, right? I have been lucky to not have been canceled aggressively yet, right? I mean, I may be unemployable, but there have been people who've stepped in for me and higher up in the institution. But I always the feminist journal standing strong was great. Again, I'm not so sure things may have gone worse after. So I mean, I've been an advocate for years of institutional neutrality. I think that it is it's unclear to me how institutions cannot be scholarly intellectual institutions cannot be unneutral when they have so many academics in under them, right? It political bias in the academies are sorry political yeah like the demographics of how do I say this? I'm trying to say that there's a lot less Republicans in the academy. Let me just be clear, right? The data is very clear, and so on one hand, we should be we should really be really giving room to those views if there's less, right? That's a basic intellectual point, right? I always try to explain to my students and to others that the academy is less strong when it's just a bunch of people who believe the same things speaking to themselves, because we don't know how to defend our positions, right? And I've seen this, I say this full disclosure, I won't mention names, but I've seen this both on the right and the left. The rare right-wing scholar who doesn't often get challenged is a bit sloppy in his or her arguments, as much as the left-wing scholar who never gets challenged. They get we fall into complacency, right? The good news is I make everybody angry, so I never fall into complacency. I'm so much better. No, I'm just kidding. But you know what I mean? Like there's a complacency that each side can fall into. And so institutional neutrality is key. I mean, to answer the question a little more tightly, institutions that have adopted the University of Chicago statement, which is like a free speech statement, you can Google that. That's about institutional neutrality. So any that have done that, I think behind the scenes, MIT, or not even behind the scenes, MIT, in the 3 times that professors were called to Congress a couple of years ago, MIT, I think, did the most to make to change what was going on in there that might have been sort of anti-intellectual, right? President Sally Kornbluth, I believe her name is, they've done good work. At Penn, my own president had to resign. I don't even want to. The politics of all that and that's
Yeah.
all very complex. But all that to say, institutional neutrality, and just having spine. If a scholar publishes something, especially this is especially easy for a journal, but even at universities, if your scholar published something peer reviewed or even a popular piece, the institution definitely shouldn't chastise people. That's crazy, right? Especially for extracurricular speech. I mean, of course, there are limits. I'm not even an academic freedom complete absolutist. I'm pretty absolute, but there are boundaries. But in general, institutions, they need to stop putting their thumb on the scale. And I've argued that they did it for social media clout. that's in my queer majority piece, that I argue that sometimes they really did it for social. And I don't think they thought, now I'm not saying they thought about it that way. I'm not pessimistic. I think people thought they were doing the right thing, but we know the expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think that happened a lot since about 2020 in the Academy.
And so in your queer majority piece, and I think this is really important. I personally think this is really important. We're going to do some more with this with ILV. You do point out that there is this mirror sort of what the right is, encroaching, right? The Trump administration is encroaching and doing using some of the same tactics. And I just had to write a nastygram to my entire university because they were carrying on about their, the horrible things that the Trump administration may do to academia. And I just fired off, because they were copying the world. And I said, let me show you, because of what they did to me, let me show you how these match up. Here's what you did to me. Here's what you're claiming is horrible. Here's what you did to me. Here's what you're claiming is horrible. And so, I would like it if you talked a little bit more about that too, because it is in your piece and I want people to read it, but I think it's really important.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, that is a corner. The reason I wrote the piece, it argues, and again, with the title, it's Academe, Age of Assholes. And the argument isn't just that academics and institutions are assholes. It kind of argues Trump is as well, right? But Elizabeth really had it spot on. There's definitely a mirroring. On one hand, and I argue this in the piece, and I will argue this in real life, Trump is overbroad. The DOE movements, there's a legal case, the legal case that struck down affirmative action, Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA. The finding in that case, a recent Dear Colleagues letter at universities was put out arguing the findings in SFFA should be expanded to almost every aspect of the university. There may be good reasons for doing that. I want to be very clear. I wish Trump was not the sword of cleaning out this house, right? That's where I want to start this conversation, right? That's important.
The house needs to be cleaned.
Right, but not by this janitor, right? Like, but not that they're a better, so yeah, but I mean, it is interesting, especially in an era of protests on campus around Israel-Palestine. Now there's a free speech ethos on campus, but 4 years ago there wasn't, right? People are being silenced for saying very inane, sometimes some of the most inane things. As I mentioned in Queer Majority, the piece, someone was asked to step out of a class because he used the Chinese pause word that sounds like an American racial slur, and not sounds very like it. I mean, this is not one of those things that's trying to be rationalized. No, he was literally speaking Chinese, using a pause word, which is like the word like in English. Right. Yeah, right. And so there's nothing that the Trump administration, as I see, has tried to impinge on university life in ways that the universities haven't tried to impinge on scholars' rights, right? Both due process, which even for, I think, people who are Trump supporters, due process is one of the things where he might begin to lose them, right? Because due process is an important part of the American, the right to trial and everything be done procedurally correct, right? It's a very important part of being American, the American ethos, right? Ethos. But yeah, I mean, the silencing of feminists, I mean, in some ways, I hate to say, I didn't occur to me this. To answer your question, in some ways, I think the universities may have done a little bit, some things that were a bit shadier, I think, than the Trump administration, in that his or broad attacks, these were individual, because my work has always come from the fact that I was horrified by the way individual people, in my case, it ends up always being women, were being treated. To me, that was the be all end all. So in some ways, I think the universities selling out their own scholars and colleagues doing it is worse than the Trump movements. But yeah, I think you said it best. There's almost a one-to-one. You actually probably you might have better examples than I do, as you pointed out to your school.
One of the things that they were complaining about was, there might be this, anonymous reporting system, and I'm like, hello, I have it in writing that you wanted to implement an anonymous reporting system. However, it was only for you thought it would only be used for topics that you were interested in, right? And so I think if you had problems, and you and I certainly have major problems with what the progressive left was doing, internally, right? You should have problems with what's coming from the right also. So it would be hypocritical of me to say, oh, you know, it was the woke left, only the woke left, when it is, you know, it's sort of, what is that, like the horseshoe theory or something, where like the extremes are more alike than they are different. And the tactics, I agree with you, you know, they're just being much more upfront with it there. And they're saying, oh, well, no, this is how you interpret the law. And so the law is where, you know, academics before were just sort of doing these, you know, sort of these personal, you know, attacks. And we've talked a lot about here at ILV about pre-publication censorship, which is what you're talking about in some of these cases, and that these are, you know, we don't always know that when that happens. So this example that you have, but there's, I mean, how many? Thousands and thousands, probably. People like me who were canceled, who were nobodies, right? I don't have a voice. I'm not on social media. There have to be hundreds of me, maybe thousands of me, thousands of people like you who, you know, did their research, did their due diligence on something that was topical, important, right, and very social, cultural, you know, topic, which is what most social scientists are, right? That's what we're doing, right? Topical things, and then we get ruined for it. So, you know, there's this, and I don't know, did that person's book ever get published? Did it get published or not?
So the book was published after it had a neutral editor, was anything but neutral. She had to write a long, tedious response. It was a mess. Then they've never released the book as part of the e-catalog, which is unheard of. Every other book is in the e-catalog. And they try to bump her second book from there. They was already in a contract and written. They try to get rid of it. They couldn't because of the contract. They did end up bumping the price. So it did get published, but there was so much downstream
Right.
negativity from the institution too, right? That was not even from the cancel initiators, as I call them, got what they wanted from Oxford University Press. Whereas Oxford University Press made a statement that seemed strong in support, and then, you know, sort of, so to your point about sort of behind the scenes or sotto voce, did some things that were less than above board.
Right, right. And I don't think we have, so at least we know when an article is forced to be retracted, in JPSP, when Journal of Social Personality Psych Science, it was Psych Science, the flagship of the Association for Psychological Science, you know, when that editor, you know, got the axe and everything, we know that, right? Like, we know it after the fact. There was an article, and then, you know, but this stuff that happens beforehand, you know, we have no idea what's not getting published. And again, you can see that from the right now, saying, oh, we're not even going to go through like the Lancet or Journal of American Medical Association. We're going to, you know, publish on our own. We're not even going to go through those, you know, those journals, sort of figuring out how to marginalize, you know, journals or authors or whatever, and only certain ones get exposure. And that's, I mean, again, plenty of problems, right, with the publication system, the peer review system. There's plenty of problems. The house needs to be cleaned. This is maybe not, using the same tactics is not, same, you're using the same dirty cloth to dust things off. So,
Right.
I was thinking that there was something else from your article, that
Can I, what, well,
yeah, go
may
ahead.
I make, I do want to say, so talking a little bit more about the affirmative action SFFA, just the legal side of things, and in terms of cleaning house, one thing that I've sort of said off the record for years is that academics are not well versed in sort of the laws that apply to them and the way they teach students, or the way that, you know, and it was actually, I thought about this because something you had mentioned about, your experiences at your school, where they like they only want to go after, they thought the laws were only for things that they
Right.
liked, right. I mean, at the end, you're seeing now, and you saw this actually in the dissent. So you saw this in the dissent for students for fair admission, right? Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson argues that, you know, the way, basically the legal argument was meant to sort of just protect certain races, right? And that's a sort of flip on the head of the American idea of like sort of equality across. Now, of course, we all know that was not how historically that's been problems, right? But the idealness of the full equality, and I think universities are running to that issue. I mean, we're seeing that now with sort of legal challenges to anti-Semitism on universities, right? We're seeing this moment where discrimination law, which many people thought they loved 100% and were 100% supportive, they're learning, well, actually, there are people they thought they could discriminate. I mean, I don't want to be sort of, but I think that's true. I think there are people that are realizing that laws they thought that rightfully protected causes they cared about also rightfully protect people, they don't
And
want
causes.
they don't want to
Yeah.
protect, right?
Right.
And that is a reckoning that I don't think academics I don't think they realize the law side, and I don't think that's a reckoning they're always willing to have. Right. I think people are more open, but I think that's a big problem that is going to be a conflict legally, and like, so that's a powder keg waiting to explode. And you're seeing that with contemporary lawsuits. Professor Amy Wax is suing Penn. And if you look at I'm not telling people to look at the case, but if you look at the filing, you're seeing this sort of, she's making arguments that are basic anti-discrimination arguments, right? People may hate what she said, people may hate what she's done, but she's making arguments on the basis of identity, which is how the discrimination law is structured. And there are other lawsuits in play like that right now. And like I said, I say this making no I'm making no commentary on her laws, but I've argued you will see more of these lawsuits. We saw one about pronouns in the case is Merriweather versus Hattrop. Yeah, a Christian philosophy professor was sanctioned by his school for refusing to use the pronouns a student wanted him to use. And I mean, again, people can feel however they want about this. That case interests me because it felt like a compromise case in which the institution, this answers the institution question someone asked. The institution was adamant the professor had to use pronouns. And so the professor responded to refer to students as Mr. and Mrs., all students, right? Or, I mean, not as a
Ms.
just
or whatever. Yeah.
right. Yeah. He responded to them by last name with a title. And the student who was a trans woman wanted the professor to refer to the student as Ms. whatever. The professor didn't feel comfortable doing that on the grounds of his religious beliefs. But he did offer to say, I'll just use your last name, to drop the gendered titling. The student wasn't happy. Maybe the student's right. I don't know. But the point is the institution laid on the professor, and then he won $400,000 in a courtroom, right? Like that's the end of that story, because the institution thought that they were going to get him for discrimination. And I mean, again, he had been particularly reasonable in this case. I wouldn't be mentioning this case, if he was just aggressively trying to. I think the duty of the professor is to, treat students respectfully, right? So if he was actively trying to harm, but he tried to offer compromise. I respect the trans student also didn't feel like that compromise was sufficient. That's all. Again, I'm putting all that to the side, but all that to say, I do believe that the academics think the law is on their side, and it is for things, but it protects everybody, right? And that's the clash that it's already coming out a little bit, and you're going to see more of it, in my opinion, my humble opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think it's interesting, and this is to circle back like to almost to where we started, where, academics are they're not more intellectual sometimes than, they're not thinking about these nuance. They were trained to think about nuance. They were trained to think about things, as you say, when you're doing your research, not to have the answer in your mind when you go in to ask the question, right? And yet it seems, and this is something that, I've said straight up to people, it's like, you forgot your training. You forgot the ethics of your field. You cast all of that aside in order to, have your moment, as you said, like this moment in time where you got to, I don't know, tweet or engage or, be recognized for standing up for something, you cast all of that aside, and it may come back to bite you. It may come back. Yeah. So in many ways we're not, we're just human. We're just as human as everybody else. And unfortunately, I say this all the time. I'm in the Department of Psychology, and I say, we could take a social psych book, textbook, and we could just let it fall open to any page, and we would find ourselves in there. It's just not, we know that social psych textbook inside and out, and yet there's a reason why that research made it into a social psych textbook, because we're all like that. We're all like that. And, you know, this is not a, it's not a moral flaw. It's not a personality flaw to think those thoughts, but you don't always need to do it. Maybe you shouldn't be, you know, doing it. So do you think that you end your piece in Queer Majority, you say that you're a little bit positive? Now I'm kind of Debbie Downer, so I don't feel that positive. So maybe you can convince us. We have like 5 minutes. I don't know if we have any other questions. You know, be sure to type them in. But can you convince me that it's that it's not the end of the world here?
You know, so it's funny. As I passed that piece around, because it came out the other day for people to know, it came out recently, and I passed it around to a couple of friends, and two of them said, shocked by the optimism at the end. And
Yeah.
I was like, interesting. So you know, it's like it's so bad because no, I mean, talk about being scholarly. I got a gut instinct. You know, I have faith. You know why I have faith? Because I have a lot of off the cuff I mean, I have a lot of because of the work that I do. I hear some of the truest stuff you'll ever hear from people who I can't repeat it. I can't even tell you said it, but I hear a lot of murmurings around universities. Um, and so one thing I'm realizing is the universities were ill prepared for the Trump onslaught. They did not know they were the target. And what that taught me, and faculty at the university and administrators, and what that's taught me is that they didn't actually know they were being so biased and had lost the institutional neutrality, had lost the unpoliticization of research. No, no, you're like no.
So you
I
don't,
guess
okay, that's interesting that they didn't realize that they'd lost their neutrality. Okay.
for example, let me tell you, I once told a professor, I was like, we had a kind of argument about a syllabus in a class that I was in off the right, privately. And I said, well, I thought because you chose these four critical race theory texts, like that's your politic. And it occurred to me that people don't study this, and I'm not a scholar of race, but I've been in grad school a long time. There's critical race theory, and there's about 12 other ways you can study race. And actually, I sort of mentioned this in the piece. And so people make these sort of shortcuts that are highly political, and I'm now realizing that everyone thinks that. And again, I don't know. Maybe I'm taking too much agency from the PhD people with PhDs, but I think they truly believe that when someone is anti-CRT, they're automatically anti-Black, and they don't want to teach about Black anything, right? And that's just simply not true. And again, I don't hold anyone accountable for that. I don't expect a mathematician to know the intricacies of the difference between studying race versus critical race theory, right? And I think both camps politically have done a really good job of making the discourse unmanageable, right? I think the left is saying that it's an esoteric legal theory is completely false. That's just a false statement. But again, the right saying everything to do with race is critical race theory is also a false statement, right? And so I think academics, again, this is an optimism, and I may not convince you, but it is an optimism I have, is that some of them actually really, they do believe in they want to find truth. They have an epistemology of truth seeking. It may be banged up. I take your comments in stride. It may be banged up. People have gotten, I think, I'll be honest with you, the last 10 years have done a lot of damage to people's epistemological moral compasses. I don't want to say moral compasses, but the way people are thinking about, and the way the internet tries to get us to think about the world, I don't think is very helpful. But yeah, I have hope that when you explain to people, I mean, the gay and lesbians' rejection of queer theory is an example of this too, right? I sort of reject queer theory as an epistemological point in many, many ways. I'm published in the field. I haven't published it, but I've sort of rejected it. I do gay and lesbian work, for example. I think, I've found talking that out with scholars and lay people is helpful. And so I do think, I have a very optimistic view of the American citizenry, of academics too, even though I write horrible things about them. I do think I mean this. I do think people are geared towards justice, and I think that scholars. very much into account that some of them definitely know. I mean, some of them are ideologues, to your point. I think some of them are absolute ideologues, but I have faith the largest majority, 11 years of grad school, dealing with people as their student, right? Because I'm not their peer. I'm technically their lesser in that way. I do have faith. I have faith that they want a just academy. And it stings them to be so wrong, but some of them are very open to being told they've kind of lost the plot. Some less so. Those are the ones, but yeah, I mean, I don't know if that convinced anybody, you or anybody in the audience, but I do have faith. And like I said, I was surprised when people told me my work was optimistic, because historically it has not been. I am a hyper critic of Academe. But and again, off the record, academics have said things to me that they've said. I mean, in my dissertation, there's a notion about public-private divide. Things academics say privately, I know they would not say publicly, and they gear towards enlightenment and justice, not towards a biased politic. But again, they say it to me privately, so what good is that? Maybe. I don't know, right? So
yeah, and I've
so
definitely said that to people who've been privately supportive of me, over the years, I mean, even just, as recently as a month ago, at an event, several people on my campus, oh, I'm really sorry, and I was like, you know what, I mean, thank you for saying that, you were too big of a coward to come forward at the time. I mean, I guess that's nice, but I mean, too little, too late, kind of like, I mean, there is that aspect where we may have, I mean, we have a credibility problem with the public, and you point that out in the article. You're not the first to point that out, but certainly, you do a good job of describing that, and we have done it to ourselves. And so, yeah, I mean, I hope you're right that that we're up to the job. So, yeah, I don't see any more questions. I appreciate very much everybody sticking with us through our our technical difficulties.
thank you.
And thank you again. Hopefully, we'll see you maybe on the Dissidents podcast.
Sweet. Great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you so
Ryan.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.